I'm so sleepy. It's kind of late, later than my usual streams have been, but I'm trying to get it done. I'm still in the spiral staircase room. My hair is so curly because I had a person curled it today, not me. It's like really, it's a lot. Like considering the fact that it is bedtime, it's 11:40 p.m. and it's still this bounce. It's a little crazy. Anyway, perfect segue into the chapter. It's basically becoming, it used to be a biography of Robert Moses. The last thing I remember is that it just kind of turned into a biography of Al Smith, former governor of New York. Okay. I'm going to keep this. This one's going to be kind of short today. I just don't think I have it in me. Okay. There's somebody named Katie in the story, and I think it might be Al Smith's wife. Katie tied 2 brooms upright on the iron railings that lined the 6 steps to the doorway of the tenement in which the Smiths lived. It was a traditional gesture in the neighborhood, symbolizing a clean sweep by Tammany. Inside, in his living room, holding his mother's hand as he accepted congrats, Alfred E. Smith, red-faced and loud in victory, resplendent in a new suit with wide-set broad pinstripes, a tie that matched his voice, and a pearl stick pin, a big black cigar tilted cockily up from the corner of his red, wet lips, seemed the typical, regular Tammany brave. Yet, what lurked behind the war paint? Al Smith went to Albany unprepared to be a legislator, or even to sleep away from home. On his first night in the capital, he noticed a large blazing fire in the fireplace of his hotel, saw that the room to which he and another new Tammany assemblyman, Tom Collin, from Battery Dan Finn's district, had been assigned. The room he and this guy had been assigned was not near any exits, and was so worried that the hotel would burn down, that they would be trapped, that he made Collin spend the night playing Pinochle, Pinochle, so that they would be awake for any emergency. Arriving in the assembly chamber the next morning, he was bewildered by the formalities of the opening session and was shunted by leaders who had no time even to talk to him to a desk so far from the speaker's podium that he often couldn't hear the rulings. When he did hear, he often didn't understand. Overcome by the intricacies of the legislative process, he sat day after day in the high-ceilinged chamber in silence. During the whole session, he did not make a single speech. He was not appointed to a single committee. Worst of all were the bills. He was not appointed to a single... Every morning when he arrived at his desk, there would be a pile of new ones a foot high. He would try the one that looked simplest, perhaps an act setting the maximum size of vehicles using public highways. Quote, "The provisions of this subdivision," he read, shall not apply to vehicles and implements or combinations thereof not over 13 feet in width, and designed and intended for use solely for farm purposes, when owned or in the possession of a dealer in farm implements and equipment, and within a radius of 50 miles of the principal place of business of such a dealer, including transportation of such vehicles, implements, and combinations thereof as a load on another vehicle, such vehicle or load, blah, 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 blah. I'm skipping that, or the rest of it. It's even longer. This was the simplest. The one underneath it might be 11 pages long, beginning, "Without limiting the generality of the following provisions of this section, property owned by the city and property used for transportation purposes, exclusively pursuant to the provisions of a joint arrangement, blah, 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 blah." The rest of the paragraph. As he sat there staring at the desk, a page boy would deposit another pile of bills on it. The wording was difficult enough for the expert. It might have been designed to mock a man whose schooling had ended in the 8th grade, who had never liked to read even the simplest books of childhood. He had said once, had in his entire life, he had said once, had in his entire life read only one book cover to cover. The Life of John L. Sullivan is the name of the book. I don't know who that is. L. Sullivan, and that's a professional boxer who lived 1858 to 1918. Cool. Yeah, that's definitely a professional boxer. Maybe he's kind of famous. As far as the course of the Empire State was concerned, it did not seem to matter if Al Smith understood the bills or not. The Democrats, a badly outnumbered minority in the Senate and Assembly, a party that had not elected a governor since 1893, and this is taking place in like 1903-ish, so it's been like a decade, had no real say in the state's affairs. Most of the Democratic legislators, understanding this and understanding that in the rare instances in which their votes were important, they would be told how to cast them by the leaders back in New York, took their jobs with the lightness they felt they deserved. They spent their evenings in the Gut, a strip of whorehouses and cheap saloons down the hill from the Capitol. The Gut? Smith, whose devotion to Katie was and remained always legendary as long as he lived, had no interest in the whorehouses, but he loved to sit with his fellow assemblymen in the saloons and drink beer and sing, and when he worked up his nerve, tell a joke or two. As often as they rousted out of a saloon by the Assembly Sergeant at Arms for a vote, he would appear in the chamber with his derby over one ear. His clothes were of the same cut, his voice as loud, his language as crude. In appearance, he was one of them. But late in the evenings, when the parties were still loud, Al Smith would leave the saloons, and as he left, his steps would quicken. Hurrying back to his tiny furnished room in a cheap boarding house, he would sit down at a rickety desk. On the desk, he would earlier have piled the bills that had been introduced that day. Al Smith would begin reading them, not only the bills which bore on a subject in which he was interested, and not only the bills which dealt with his assembly district, and not only the bills which dealt with New York City. Sitting at the rickety desk in the furnished room, Smith read all the bills, even those which concerned the construction of a side road or a tiny dam in some remote upstate district. And as he read them, he tried to understand them. Why had one legislator included in a bill a provision that the dam be built by the Conservation Department rather than the Department of Public Works? What had been in the mind of another that had led him to specify that the side road must be surfaced with a specific type of asphalt? Later in the night, Smith would hear bursts of song and laughter as the other legislators left the saloon. One by one, if he looked out the window in his room, which faced the Capitol, he could see the lights in the huge gray building go out. Still, the man who had never liked to read read on. It must have seemed like the most useless of exercises. In his second term, he was appointed to two committees, but they were the Committee on Banks and the Committee on Public Lands and Forests. And as he remarked in later years, quote, I had never been in a bank except to serve a jury notice, and I had never seen a forest. He had never seen a forest. It's kind of cool how the more you learn about people, the more you're like, the more interesting and like they become and the more easy it is to love them. Like, I'm just like, man, I love Al Smith. Again, he did not make a single speech during the entire session. The Democratic leaders had no interest in him except for his nod of assent at the end of a discussion. And the expenses of living in Albany, for which the legislators received no reimbursement, ate up an assemblyman's $1,500 salary. By May, all but $250 was gone and 7 incomeless months stretched ahead of him. In despair, he told Foley he didn't want to run again. Meet me at Holtz's for breakfast tomorrow morning, Foley said. Over ham and eggs, Foley offered Smith another job. New York City Superintendent of Buildings. Smith's eyes lit up. Foley's were narrow. Watching the younger man closely, he said, "If you take the job, of course, you'll never be a big man in this town. I gave you a start toward being one. It's tough for a beginner in Albany. You can't learn what you need to know up there in a couple of years. But you're learning, and you've got great popularity in the district. I think that you're on the right track, and I'm willing to stick with you if you want to go back. But maybe you ought to chuck it." "Maybe," Big Tom Foley said. "You're right in thinking that Albany is too tough for you." Tom Foley is like the politics guy, Tammany Hall organizer guy. Yeah. Foley said he would give Smith a week to think it over. In a week, Smith said he wanted to go back. Both of those were single paragraphs. When he went back, he read harder. Still, since most of the bills amended or referred back to other bills passed years before and not described in the new bills, he took to spending evenings in the legislative library reading those old bills. Since some of the most confusing wording was based on legal technicalities, Smith began to borrow law books from law libraries and take them back to the furnished rooms with him. Sometimes, leafing through the thick volumes, he thought wryly that their appearance would have intimidated him a few years before. Tired of listening to speeches he couldn't understand, he would pay clerks for transcripts and study the transcripts. Near the end of the session, the annual appropriations measure, hundreds of pages long, containing tens of thousands of items, was published. No one, so far as anyone in Albany could remember, had ever read the entire appropriations bill. In 1906, Al Smith read it. Now, he was to say, Albany began to make some sense to him, but he kept that fact to himself. Years later, Foley would say, quote, he would never admit that he knew anything about a subject until he knew everything about it. To his fellow legislators, he was still the typical Tammany regular. He cleared his votes with Foley, never argued with the leaders, and instead of making speeches, saved his voice for the nightly singing in the saloons. He had many friends in Albany now. He arrived at the Capitol each morning with a fresh supply of jokes, hilarious stories told in a variety of dialects, and legislators and clerks would crowd around him to hear them. During a debate on a bill proposed to regulate Chinese laundries, Smith suddenly burst into the assembly chamber bearing a huge sign decorated with Chinese characters. Surprisingly, his friends included Republicans as well as Democrats. No one would have seemed less likely to get along with the aristocratic upstate Republicans, born into families that controlled the great utilities and banks of the state and educated among the ivy, than Al Smith. But his jokes had them roaring too. The rising star of a band of reforming Republicans who were trying to unseat the Black Horse Cavalry, which is a political group. Can't remember what they do, but I remember looking it up on Wikipedia, and it was very obscure and only existed around this time. Okay, so among the people trying to reform Republicans was a young Jimmy Wadsworth, a scion of one of the wealthiest families in Rochester and a former Yale baseball star. Wadsworth soon began to make a regular supper trio with Smith and a slow-talking, forceful, young German-born state senator who had become particularly close to Smith, Robert F. Wagner, who later became the governor, I think, or the New York City mayor. His name is familiar. Senior elected speaker, Wadsworth handed Smith some choice committee assignments. In 1908, after Smith had swept his district for the 5th time, he found himself, on his return to Albany, one of the capital's most influential Democrats. He was expected now to use the voice that he had kept silent so long. And when he did, people began to listen. The years spent reading the obscure minor bills began to pay off, because no matter what the subject was, the other legislators began to realize Al Smith understood it. In some way that they were unable to figure out, He had become familiar with their little pet projects, their side roads, the peculiar problems of their districts. Moreover, when Smith rose to speak, the assembly chamber became a place of drama. Quote, his presence electrifies and wins over even his opponents, Dean Christian Gauss of Princeton was to say. His voice makes his listeners tingle. The voice was nasal, grating, harsh, and insistent, and unforgettable. One journalist wrote it had trumpets in it. Coupled with the wit of the man who used it, it could tear an opponent apart or make a bored man. It could make a bored men or make bored men roar with laughter. A Buffalo assemblyman once tried to correct Smith's grammar. The assembly, well aware of Smith's lack of education, waited silently for his reply. Slowly he arose. I will, he said with dignity, refer the gentleman from Buffalo to the rule that says, when a pluperfect adjective precedes a noun, insert a plus. It could even hold the attention of the legislators during arcane discussions of state finances. One reporter wrote, discussion of the annual appropriation bill used to be the signal for a general exodus from the assembly chamber, but not so when Al Smith took the floor. He could keep the members in their seats hours on end with his masterly dissection of that matter. Charles F. Silent Charlie Murphy, the unsmiling Irishman who had risen from saloon keeper to the leadership of all Tammany Hall, had been hearing a lot about Smith. Now he said he'd like to meet him. After the meeting, someone said to Murphy, he's a nice young fellow. He has a lot of ability. It's too bad he isn't a college man. Murphy looked at the speaker a long moment. If he was a college man, he said at last, he wouldn't be Al Smith. In 1911, aided by revelations of widespread corruption among Republican legislators, the Democrats won control of both houses for the first time in 18 years. Murphy had the Democratic caucus elect Smith majority leader of the assembly. In a position of importance at last, Al Smith carried out orders. Using the powers of his office ruthlessly, he rammed through the assembly, as Bob Wagner was ramming it through the Senate, the notorious Murphy Charter, which weakened New York City's civil service system and added thousands of patronage jobs to its payroll. Oh my God, Robert Moses hates that. Good government groups railed at Smith. The Citizens Union called him one of the most dangerous men in Albany, identifying him day after day as Smith the Tammany Man. Newspapers joined in the outcry. The Democratic caucus, said a distinguished editorial in the New York World, is Charles F. Murphy at one end of the telephone wire and the Democratic leader at the other end. In all his years in the legislature, one political observer was to say Smith had never been anything more than the brilliant henchman at Albany of the organization housed in the ornate and shabby building on 14th Street. But such analyses were incomplete. Most legislators spent as little time as possible in Albany, coming to the Capitol only 1 or 2 days a week and spending the rest of time attending to their outside business interests. Murphy saw to it that Smith was offered a well-paying position with a firm doing business with the city. Finances were still tight for Smith. He could have used the money, but he turned the offer down. Instead, he spent most of every week, all of many weeks, at the Capitol. Not only did he attend every hearing held by every committee of which he was a member, but legislators began to notice he would slip quietly into hearings held by committees of which he was not a member and sit in the back of the hearing rooms, following the testimony intently. At night, he would still party loudly and happily, and he would slip away from most parties early. Now, he would slip away not to a cheap furnished room, but to the plush majority leader's suite at the 10 Ike Hotel. Now, the face bent over the pile of bills was considerably fuller than that face that had been bent over the pile 7 years before. It was redder, and its teeth, once so white, were capped with gold and yellowed by the cigar butts clenched unendingly between them. Now there was a considerable paunch beneath the pinstripes. That's such a great line. Paunch beneath the pinstripes. but the face still bent over the bills. And now a new element was added to the background of the picture. Sweatshops didn't close on Saturday, and on the Saturday afternoon of March 26, 1911, hundreds of employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, most of them girls from the Lower East Side, were still bending over swatches of material on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building overlooking New York's Washington Square. Someone in the 10th floor workroom lit a cigarette and tossed the match away. It hadn't burnt out when it fell into the ankle-deep litter around the sewing machines. Ugh, I forgot about that detail. There was a puff of smoke and then a sheet of flame. The exits were inadequate, the doors to many locked. As the terrified girls jammed against them in panic, scores were crushed to death. Others were suffocated by the heavy smoke. As it billowed around them and the flames crept closer, girls leaped from windows. Bodies smashed against the sidewalks and tore through sidewalk gratings. The death toll was 141. Reformers had been haranguing against unsafe conditions in the sweatshops for years, but their harangues had thudded without effect against political stockades buttressed with campaign contributions of factory owners. Thudded without effect against political stockades. This writing is really fun in this chapter. Now they descended on Albany, led by men like Henry Moskowitz, a bunch of near hysterical women, and one very quiet one, Henry Moskowitz's wife, demanding the formation of a commission to investigate factory conditions and to recommend remedial legislation. The reformers brought with them a list of potential commission members. Smith, conferring with them, agreed to most of the names but added one, his own. At first, the reformers on the State Factory Investigating Commission looked at Smith, the Tammany man, askance. Then the commission's work began. It took the members to all the major cities of the state. Now and again, one or another of the reform members would miss a trip, but they noticed that Smith never did. They watched his face as, day after day, he saw what life in the factories was like. They watched his expression when he saw whole families, mothers with their children, little boys and girls, working all the daylight hours 7 days a week in rooms in which there was not a single window, when after one factory manager had insisted that no children under the age of 7 were employed in his plant, commission staffers found such children jammed into an elevator that had been hidden between floors to escape the commission's notice. When the reform members of the commission made their proposals, they waited for Smith's reaction. "You make the proposals," he told them. "I'll fight for them." That was a single-sentence paragraph. Even when good government organizations were continuing to rail against him, the 1912 Citizens Union summary of his record was even more devastating than its 1911 summary. A few reformers were starting to tell their friends another story. Al Smith, they said, had absolutely no general theory. His naivety in matters of philosophy was ridiculous. When he talked about social welfare legislation, it was in terms of us against them, of the people against the interests, of the Fourth Ward against factory owners. But the people, the Fourth Ward, did seem to mean something very special to him. No one could listen to him talk about how doctors' bills could eat up a man's savings and leave his family destitute, about how penniless mothers feared that the charities would take their children, about children who grew to manhood without ever having a pair of new shoes, without believing that his determination to help them was real. No one could look at his face when he talked and not know it was real. First one and then another of the reformers began to tell their friends that they had really come to believe that maybe, just maybe, after decades of waiting, reform in New York had found at last in the red-faced Tammany henchman the instrument for which it had been waiting, the champion who would fight for their dreams in the political arena and turn them into laws. And some of the more romantic among them, examining Smith's long, slow rise through the ranks of Tammany, began to speculate that perhaps all the time he had been executing its dirty work, he had been waiting for the chance to do good. When the commission's recommendations, embodied in bills, came up in the legislature, Smith fought for them. From their seats in the spectator galleries high up over the assembly chamber, the reformers could see him roaming the narrow aisles between the legislators' desks, pleading, cajoling, threatening, bargaining, dealing, trading votes, using every trick he had learned in his years of working for Tammany. Smith's debating ability was already legendary, but never, observers wrote, had he spoken like this. During a debate on a bill that would have required 1 day's rest in 7 for women and for women and children, Republican legislators, beholden to cannery interests, cannery, literally like canning companies, pleaded for exemptions for canneries. Won't anyone think of big canning? Smith waited until every Republican had finished. Then he rose and walked between their desks down to the well of the chamber. Whirling to face them, he said quietly, I have read carefully the commandment, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. I am unable to find any language in it that says, except in the canneries. Without another word, he returned to his seat. On another occasion, the man whose mother had once feared that her son would be taken from her rose to speak on widows' pensions. All right, and then it's a big quote from that lady. Honestly, you guys, I'm a little sleepy. I'm going to cut this one short, but I'll go long tomorrow. I'm quitting on the middle of page 124. My voice is very sleepy. Canning was a major industry, especially women and girls. It makes sense. Like, I'm not, like, logically I can think it through, but it's just funny because today in New York City, there are not a lot of canning factories. Not a lot of canneries. Maybe there should be. Good night. Sleep tight.